Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and of course a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. This is Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School, and I just wanna quilt. So today, a very famous quilter stops by. Yeah, pretty amazing. So Victoria Findlay Wolfe is with us. Okay, I don't even know how to describe her. She is an artist. She makes fabric, she makes patterns, she makes templates. She has a studio in New York. She's insanely cool. She teaches. She's got her own shop her shop has only her stuff in it. That's how much stuff she's created. She's amazing. So she talks to us about art and quilting and her life, and it's awesome.
My name is Victoria Findlay Wolfe, and I'm calling from New York City.
Awesome. Okay, so we start with the first question, which is, what's your first memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life?
In my house, that would be probably from my earliest, probably kindergarten. It's probably when I can first remember that. We slept under quilts that were made by my grandmother. My mother was a seamstress for Finger Hut for many years.
What is Finger Hut?
She made all of my clothes.
What is Finger Hut?
Finger Hut?
Uh-huh.
Finger Hut is a mail order company that's been around forever.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And my father also had an upholstery business on the farm. So everybody sewed. It was just a natural thing. It's what you did.
And I've been watching... in preparation for this, I got to watch lots of videos about you. So I've learned a lot about your stories that you tell about your family and the quilts that you slept under and polyester. And they're great. They're great stories. And that you were trained as an artist. And now you are a most amazing, famous quilter with a gargantuan empire, and everybody adores you. That is my summary of sort of who you are. And when I told the Quilting Army, because we call... the Facebook group, we call ourselves a Quilting Army. When I told them, they were just so excited. They had all these great stories about how when you go to teach, you are super kind to people and you hang out with them. And somebody told me to ask you about made fabric. They're madly in love. Your fan base loves you, and I am beyond excited that you're here, and I feel super honored that you're joining us to chat.
Well, it's a good thing it's not video, because that's very embarrassing. Just about everything.
Very funny. Well, again, you're amazing. And one of the things that,
whatever. Yeah.
Okay, I'm having trouble with this.
I just think that's all very odd. I'm a maker. I make things. I'm an artist from my core. Ever since I was 5 years old, I said I would be an artist. So I just make things. It's what I do.
So it's really interesting. I was thinking about your life, because I've been watching lots of videos about you, or of you, and I thought, what really struck me was when you talked about, when you're trained painter and sculptor and photographer, and now you're a quilter, obviously, and you said that when you painted, you were painting your sadness, and when you quilt, it's all about joy, and I wanted you to sort of talk a little bit more about that. And also I thought about your life, how different your life must be. Sort of artists have a lot of solitary time, and your life, being an artist that's a quilter in this industry, that's kind of the opposite of it. It seemed like a very different life being a painter versus being, empire builder in the quilt industry.
Well, I don't even know where to start with that.
No, sorry. Sorry, I'm kind of fangirling just a little bit, and so my questions are a little overly prepared. Usually I'm just like, hey guys, what's going on? But it just seemed like painting, if you're a painter, you could be an extraordinarily famous painter right now, right? And you would still be solitary, you'd have fans, but it would be really different than your life now, I would imagine.
So let me comment on that first. I'm a very introverted person. I much prefer to be sitting at my sewing machine than to be talking to people. The aspect of what I do now is completely learned. It is not something that makes me very comfortable. I can do it because I've done it so many times that I've learned how to stand in front of somebody, have people look at me, which makes me very uncomfortable. And I can talk about quilts because quilts is something that I'm very passionate about. And that's the maker in me as an artist. I can talk to you about what I want to do, but when it comes to turning that off and having to just be, I'm a very quiet person.
Really interesting.
That is completely learned, and I enjoy a good laugh because my life is based on looking for joy. So if it's not bringing me joy, I will move on. So when it becomes too much, I pull away, and that's my normal behavior. Where most people will be like, I don't believe it, I don't see it, I've heard your lecture, you make me laugh, or whatever. Like I can find the joy, but that is also a lot of work for me to be able to do that. And I think that's pretty common among most artists.
Yeah, no, I love that's really interesting. I think incredibly inspiring too, because I think, things like that. I mean, so I have a tendency, again, I'm usually like really normal, but right now I'm so not. So I was a super, super, super shy child, to the point where I never got in trouble for talking until I was in junior in high school ever. But then the boy that I fell in love with and married a long time after that, he taught me how to be human, kind of thing. Like I could talk with people and be all that. So I find that really inspiring that like you can have this outward professional thing, like you've learned it, and that you can still have your inward quiet space. I think that's really interesting, and I think in some ways super, like inspiring in some way, right? That you can be quiet and an introvert and still like have a public persona and recognize those are two different things. And I think that's really cool. Do you feel like, how do you deal? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Part of that is when you're trying to find the joy, if I'm teaching and I can see that I'm having an effect to my students, that's the part that brings me joy as well. So that's the part that keeps pulling me outside of my shell. So with that's the gift that quilting has given me, is that it has pulled me out of my own shell so that
that's
I can
really
have.
Cool. That's very cool. Now, how do you feel about all of the sort of pressure of social media and being present and all of that? Do you feel like, how do you feel about all that?
Part of it comes with the job, and part of it is still part of my process. So as a maker, I make 24/7. That's what I do. I'm creating. So whether I'm showing something on Instagram to possibly inspire you, whether it's for a new product that I have or a new commission that I finished, I'm showing it because I'm proud of what I've done, but I'm also inspiring you when you're looking at it going, oh my God, well, I could do that. Again, that's where joy comes back to me. So all of that, even though it's social media presence, whatever that is, still it falls under the part of the process. The process to me is the part that's the most inspiring and the most interesting. When I'm working on a quilt, it's the idea, it's the start of the idea, it's the things that get me from A to B to C to E in the project. And by the time I finish the project, I'm done with it, I'm over it, I'm not interested in it anymore, and I'm ready to start the next project.
It's really interesting. Yesterday I had someone from Germany talking about, she had posted a picture online, and then another group someplace in the world was made versions of it and told her about it, and she freaked out a little bit because she didn't really expect all of that. When you post online, is there an expectation that you're inspiring, that people may try to copy it? Like, does it... the puppies. That's good.
Told you that would happen in a minute.
That's all good.
Might be one more little burst.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Is like when you, I guess, when I was talking to her, I was like, well, you control when you post. It's all good.
I'm just having her take the dog off. Excuse me 1 second.
Okay.
Monica. I don't know. For the minute, she's not barking.
you control when you post, but that's like, then it goes out in the world. Do you feel that way that you, because I've heard on some of your, like, you can't show things because it's going to be in the book, and like there's a recognition that like the moment it's out there, it's got a different life. Do you feel that way?
Oh, absolutely. There's also this sort of reinvent the wheel sort of a thing. Not really reinvent the wheel, but the power of constantly creating something to keep people interested. So there's a pressure to that. Although I don't really have a problem with that because I've always got 1,000 ideas going in my head, and so I have more of an issue that when I put out a book, some of the quilts will be patterned and some of the quilts will not be patterned, because I do create as an artist, and I also create as commercially. Yeah. So I make things that I want to make specifically. I will have other ideas, and those other ideas are the patterns that I'll put out that everybody else wants to make or that they can make because they're more commercially driven. Yeah. Both of those styles of quilting are very important to me. Now we have fire engines.
That's okay.
Welcome to New York City.
Totally. It's great. It's authentic. So
both of those sides of the spectrum really interest me. So I love to create the quilts that I want to make. My point about the book, and some of them are patterned and some are not patterned, or that if a quilt is that I've shown is not patterned and not available, that is because I've made it specifically for personal reasons, and I don't want that quilt copied.
That's really interesting.
It's not meant to have another quilt that looks exactly like it.
I like
that.
That
is that I do make quilts that my whole teaching philosophy, though, is actually that you can create something that looks more you than me. I don't want you to make my quilts. I want you to make your quilts. I'm teaching you how to look at shapes. I'm actually teaching you how to look. I'm not even really teaching you how to do anything else. I'm showing you how you can look at these shapes and put colors and and materials together in a way to make something that reflects you. Quilting for me is a very personal journey. I'm making the quilts that I want to make for myself. Every quilt I make is definitely part of a healing journey because that's what I'm doing. I'm doing it to heal something that brings joy.
That's really interesting. I have 1,000 questions off of that. So you were part of a book called Quilting. Is it Quilting and Healing or Quilting and Health? No, what is it called? Quilting and... Oh, it's at the end. I thought we were going to get to that there. Quilts and Health. Tell me sort of, and I really do, the end of it, so I quilt every night. I'm not a good quilter. I'm an okay quilter. I'm like an intermediate quilter, and I don't care. I don't want people seeing my quilts. It's a private thing. But I also see it as super healing. At the end of the day, that there's a space, it feels like I'm healing by quilting. And I'm curious what you just talked about, like that. Tell me what your thoughts are about sort of that intersection of quilting and healing and health.
Well, sometimes I don't know what I'm healing when I'm making something. Sometimes the story presents itself later. Sometimes it has a story that kicks it off. So the quilt that is in Quilts and Health is based on a quilt. So when I was growing up on the farm, if you were sick and you had to stay home from school, we had a quilt that was called the sick quilt. And you would get to snuggle under this quilt, and it was super soft. It had Indian cotton on one side. It had raw cotton in the batting on the sorry, I just said the inside. On the outside of the quilt, Indian cotton, raw cotton in the inside, and very soft, small corded corduroy, red corduroy on the back of the quilt. And it's Minnesota, it's cold. We didn't have heat on the farm. We had wood stoves. So if the wood stoves burn out, it's very cold. So we would have this super snuggly quilt that we got to sleep under. So once I became a parent and my daughter was little, I thought, well, gee, if that quilt is still around, I might actually like that. So I called my mother up and I said, is that quilt still around? She said, sure. So she sent it out and we used that as the sick quilt. And as soon as it came into my life, my daughter was super sensitive to very soft fabrics. Things have to be soft or she wouldn't put them next to her skin. And so when she felt that quilt, she decided that was going to be her quilt on her bed. So never mind the fact that the quilt was now probably 40 to 45 years old. She's now sleeping under it on her bed for quite a few years, and it's just disintegrating. So I decided that I needed to make a new stick quilt. So that's the quilt with the story that's in that book. And that started out when I had first found a quilt blog online, and Tanya Rakucci, she did wordplay quilts, was doing a lot of different challenges. And I was so inspired that I was like, this woman is just right up my alley, because I just cut stuff up and sew it back together, not knowing that there were quilt patterns and all of these designs. I just thought you cut stuff up and sewed it together, because that's how I saw my mother make clothing, because she didn't need patterns to be able to do that. My father would take apart furniture and sew it back together without a pattern. I thought that's just what you did. My grandmother made scrap quilts where the pieces were already pre-cut for her and thrown in a bag, because she was an arthritic invalid and couldn't use the scissors. So my mom and her sisters would cut all the fabrics apart. So she was using things as they were found and not using a pattern. I thought that's what you did. So I cut a bunch of fabrics apart and I started building this improvisational quilt, which turned out to be, it says, what does it even say? Rest, get well, chicken soup, some stuff like that. Yeah. And made a nurse and medicine and healing and red crosses and like all of these things that represent feeling better. That's and then I put the red corduroy on the back of the quilt. So I thought, well, since the other quilt was falling apart, now we have this raw, beautiful, pieced with love, and it's going to make her feel better. And then there again, there's the joy right at the end of it.
There's the joy. That's right. There's the joy. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I feel like as makers and as people who spend a lot of time with fabric, that as you quilt, there's something more happening, that it isn't just about sewing pieces together, that there's love, there's something going into those quilts, that even when you pick up an old quilt, maybe it's just something you're putting on, like I'm, projecting onto it, but it just seems like a lot more than just fabric to me. Do you feel that way about quilting, that you're putting a bit of yourself into every quilt that you make?
Every quilt I make will have a story. If it doesn't have a story, I call them a nothing quilt. Sometimes you just have to make a nothing quilt. You just need to cut some stuff apart and sew it together and just let it be. But even at the end of that, there will often be a story. So whatever happened during those moments that you were sewing those stitches together, you're putting a little bit of yourself into that. And I don't think all quilters get that. I don't think everybody realizes or quilts for that same purpose. Some people just do it to relax, and that's all it is. Some of them are obsessive about it. I definitely fall into that category. So I don't think it really matters, but I think everybody does come at it from a different perspective. I personally, I want that story in there. I want it to do something. I want it to move me. I want it to bring emotions when I'm looking at it. I want to feel something. And that's just very important to me, to be able to do that.
So very cool. Okay, so it seems like there is this moment in quilting that happens around 2006, 2007, 2008, that the generation that sort of dominates quilting, I think about you, I think about Jenny Doan, I think about Tula Pink, Mary Fons, like you all are sort of beginning every time I talk to one of you amazingly famous empire building quilters, it's happening around that particular time. Even the Crafty Gemini. Do you see a generational shift? Do you see that? Do you see your cohorts in that same way? Like there's something going on there that is different. It's a new generation, a new way of thinking. I don't know. It's kind of interesting that you're all starting about that time.
Well, I've been doing this since 2008. I don't know about everybody else, but I've been quilting for 35 years. So I don't think of it as building something. Like I said, I've been making things since I was 5. So I consider from then, I'm just doing what I'm doing because I'm going to do it, whether anything else is happening or not.
Yeah.
I always tell people in my lecture, I might not be quilting tomorrow because I can go do something else. Yeah. I can go camp tomatoes. I can go pull weeds in my garden. I can go recover and refurnish a piece of furniture. All of these things bring me joy. At this particular moment, I'm using textiles.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah. I'm just doing what I that's just where I'm at this particular moment. And whether I have any of the other stuff, it makes no difference to me.
Yeah.
I just want to keep making.
So, when you say that the winning Quilt Con started it all for you, what do you mean by that? Like, do you mean like in terms of, tell me what you mean by that.
I didn't say that.
You didn't?
Other people have said that. Yeah, no, I don't think that started anything. I'd already been, like I said, I started in 2008 quilting full time. So
yeah,
I already had a book out by the time Quilt Con came along.
Yeah.
I started my blog in 2009.
Yeah.
People think that started everything for me. I've been doing this for much longer.
You've been doing it, yeah.
This is about putting the time in and putting my work in. That quilt that won at Quilt Con was a very personal journey for me, and I had planned, when I'd finished that, I actually considered not entering it because I didn't think people would understand it. And it was a pivotal moment in a process change for me. And I felt very connected to that quilt and had a million ideas that happened within that one project. And I went on to make, that was the first of 13 quilts that I made just for myself. From every idea that I'd received while making that first quilt, that led to me making 13 more, which is now over 70 double wedding rings. That moment, though, of those 13 quilts that I made, there were quilts that I had to make for myself. They were not made to be in a book. I made the quilts. They were all a personal journey. I made all of them, and which led to more, of course. And then those quilts went on to be exhibited, and then the book came later about double wedding rings. That pretty much sums up a lot about how I work in general. I make the quilts, and then they kind of become a life of their own.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask you about that because I was curious, do you know what a quilt is while you're making it? Like, you're talking about sort of quilts that are private, quilts that have patterns, quilts that don't have patterns. Do you, at this stage in the game, do you have a sense of what that quilt is when you're working on it, or does that come later, or like how do you make a decision on that?
All of my quilts are completely improvisationally based, whether they have a traditional visual to them or not, whether they're a pattern or not. They all start out completely improvisational. I cut fabrics, I push things around on my design wall until I get an idea. Then the shapes and the form and the pattern start to evolve. Maybe sometimes I'll start with a traditional pattern, like if I'm looking at a double wedding ring, the shapes of the pattern itself. Then I look at how can I change the information within the shapes so that it becomes something else visually. But all of these things, these discoveries, it happens on my design wall. I don't start with a preconceived idea. I have no interest in that. In fact, once I design something on my design wall, everything gets laid out and designed on the wall. Once it's all the way that I want it, then I start to sew things together, which still means won't stay that way. It might still change as I'm sewing things together. So it's if I know, once it's all laid out on my design wall and I have to sew it together, I kind of really hate that part because there's nothing left for me to discover. It's the discoveries. The only other things that I would discover is when I sew something together wrong. And then I look at that and I go, well, is that something I can use for my next quilt? So the making the mistakes and the discovery of, well, what if I put it here? And what if I cut it that way? And what if I did this to it this time because I did that already on the last quilt? Like, I'm always looking to see, well, what else can I change and do a little bit different and what kind of effect? I spend more time looking than I do doing anything else.
That's really interesting. Okay, I have some very practical questions, which is, okay, so you put it on the design wall. I totally get that. I've done that.
I cut a huge amount of fabric, way more than I ever need for one quilt, and I make a whole bunch of pieces, and I'll cut them apart. Or I'll sew a whole bunch of scraps together and make the made fabric. You mentioned the made fabric.
Right.
Figure out how I'm going to incorporate that. Or I've looked at the made fabric and I've sewn a bunch of scraps together, and I'll find a pattern and a design within that fabric, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to replicate that. So it's all completely improvisational until it becomes something or it becomes a pattern.
Okay, so what's your strategy for getting it from the design wall to the sewing machine and keeping it in the right order? I know that's do you have a strategy?
I have probably 40,000 photos on my phone right now.
It's photographs.
Yes, I take a photograph. Every time I move a single piece of fabric, I take a photo.
Lovely.
So when I'm working on a project, you'll come across 2,000 photos in my phone of it that all seemingly look exactly the same, but there's one piece of fabric that has changed.
I love it. Totally great.
All I do is scroll backwards and forwards, making decision. Was it the right decision? Was it the wrong decision? Do I change it? Do I put it in a different color? Does it need to land in a different position? Does it need to go to the right? Does it need to go to the left? Does it need to go down, up, out, orange, white, black? Does it need to stay a whole?
That's amazing. Amazing. You're just amazing. This is just incredible. How much do you rip out?
Very little.
Interesting.
I make the quilt. I'm not a show quilter. I do show quilts in quilt shows. I will only enter quilts in shows that I think I did an exceptionally good job on. I don't enter all of my quilts. I hate paperwork, so I do not enter a lot of quilt shows. I try to enter my best work. I don't go to a quilt show and enter 5 quilts just because I have them. I look to see what do I think is my personal best at that particular moment, and I'll enter that quilt.
It's really cool.
But I'm not set out to do that. So if I'm making a quilt and I think, ooh, this is going to be my best to show quilt, I'm going to make this thing great. First of all, I don't think that way because 2, I'm not a perfectionist. I've made enough quilts. I know how to get things to line up. I know how to sew my 1/4-inch seam. I know how to make things fit together beautifully and perfectly, but I'm not obsessed about it. If I have to rip something out, I might try to fix it twice. And after that, I'm like, forget it. I'm moving on. I got more quilts to make. I don't have time to do that.
I like that.
That list in my head still has about 70 quilts on it in my lifetime that I need to get to. I'm not going to worry about whether that one seam is spot on or not, because actually once it's quilted and it's washed, you're never going to see that again.
Yeah. Okay, so here's what happens to me.
Perfectionist.
Yeah. Okay, so here's what happens to me. I believe that every quilt I'm going to make. So first of all, I never put anything in a show, and I'm not a show person at all. So this is my my fantasy that happens every time I make a quilt, and I made like 35 last year because I'm experiencing everything in every way that I can for this project. I begin believing this is going to be the most amazing quilt that anyone has ever seen ever, and then about a 1/3 of the way in, I'm like, yeah, no, nobody should see this. And then then there's a point where I think it should all be thrown away. And then by the end, I'm like, I just love it and I don't care. So do you feel like, what's your process of quilting? Like, I know mine's ridiculous, but...
So let me just comment on that, because what you just said there, that is the creative process. You get an idea, you gather your fabrics, you start to make a plan and you start to get frustrated. You cut something and then you think, well, that was just wrong. And then you think, well, I was just stupid. I can't do this project. And then you start doing a skill that maybe you have to learn something and you think, well, this is impossible. And then you think, well, I kind of like the idea, so I'm going to persevere. And so you start to learn the skill and you tackle it, or you don't, and you're still happy with it and you continue. And then you start getting more of the quilt together and you think, oh my gosh, this is going to be kind of cool at the end. And then you finish it and you're like, oh my God, I did it.
Yeah.
And then you're fabulous.
That's really great.
That's the creative process.
That's the
right
creative
there.
process.
That is normal. And that's what every single person does.
Do you think there's a moment where people feel like if they don't recognize that's the creative process, that they are throwing out quilts or they're stopping, that moment of like overwhelming, like I'm failing, that they don't just push through?
Yes. And that is a whole lot of personal baggage that I think does not belong in the creative process.
Yeah.
Yes, to making mistakes, but it's not a personal attack on you. Yeah. You shouldn't be sitting there going, oh, I'm such a failure. It's fabric. You have more fabric. You can cut it up. We all know you have more fabric, okay? We all know there's more fabric. The rest of your family might not know you have more fabric, but you know you have more fabric. Right?
Do you think
but so all of that, so like who is telling that? I have students in my classes who will be like looking at something and they'll be like, I don't know, it's just not perfect. My husband's just really not gonna like that. I'm like, Who cares?
Right.
Is he in your class right now? No, he's not here. That makes no difference.
Right. You were on the Stitch TV, Lynn and Pam, and they've got their little motto that you can get baby clothes is babies don't care. Babies don't care. Babies don't care.
All the time, and all these other people come to the classroom when someone's trying to learn something like that stuff. There is no space for that.
Yeah.
There is your opinion and your fabric, and there might be a few people in your life whose opinions matter to you. The rest of the opinions, you know what they say about those. Like everybody's got one. So you have to take care to the opinions that matter from the people who matter. But there's also a limit to that. You are the ultimate decider in your creative process to make a decision on whether or not it's good or not.
Yeah.
And ultimately, does it matter? You're making something. If you can't find joy, then you need to find a new hobby.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Go golfing, go for a walk, go, I don't know, make ceramic beads. There's got to be something else that will satisfy your creative drive, right? And not somebody else's creative drive.
So one of the things I imagine that my kid is a creative writer and intensive in a high school creative writer, so she can focus on that and sort of see the process in an art school. And I'm wondering about your training at art school. It seems like part of what art school is being comfortable with that process and being comfortable with critique and being comfortable with saying, I don't care what, like all the things you're talking about, that creative process is what you're being trained in as much as the specific art of painting or sculpture. Would you, do you know what I'm saying? The people come from lots of backgrounds, but I think in some way that gives you, that's the creating, giving you a, I don't know, tools.
A lot of the stuff that I learned in art school, and maybe it's my personality and the way that I look at things. I had a problem. I was combative, but I was also a teenager, remember, okay? Combative, do not want teachers writing or drawing on drawings or paintings that I was working on. Mm-hmm. I'm very possessive to what I do. Uh-huh. And I would get into trouble with teachers because I'd be like, don't mark on my paper. I just spent 3 hours making that drawing, and now you just put a 3-inch mark on my drawing.
And that's really
cool.
Yeah, that's really
not everybody right? is like that though, and I think that's the personality trait. I take what I do very personally, and it's mine. This is one thing that I can claim as what I do. This is what I do. I make, and these pieces are mine. So in a class critique, yes, critiques are very helpful, but again, that's a classroom full of opinions where only maybe 1 or 2 of those really matter. If you respect your teacher and you appreciate that opinion, great. Then you can take it in and you can learn from it. I don't need a room full of people telling me whether or not something is good or not, because they don't know what my emotional connection is to the project, and they don't know my joy, and they don't know what I'm healing.
Yeah. So gosh, this is the conversation.
I'm very particular about this, and I get very strong about feelings about this kind of thing. I do this for me. I try to sit over here. I make the quilts that I want to make. I keep my head down, and I just do what I want to do. When this is not bringing me joy anymore, I won't do it anymore.
That's really
I'll
great.
find something else. That's my prerogative. So for the moment, I enjoy inspiring other people to find that. That's what I like to get people to do in their classes. Not everybody can get to that point because, again, we are all coming at why we create for different reasons. But to find the people who do want to make, or I don't want to say are as obsessive about, but people who are really dedicated to it, get that.
Yeah.
And other people
that's really cool. I like that. That's really cool. Can we switch just a little bit to the sort of commercial economic side before we end? So what's cool, first of all, you have built an empire. You are one of our empire quilter builder people. You do everything: fabric, books, templates. You have a store, online store, and a regular analog store. Is that brick and mortar store? Oh, wait, hold on. Let's see. Did we lose you on the sound? Say,
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. Tell me about that side of your world, because the maker space and the creative space is one side. Do you see them as separate or integrated? How did you develop the business side of your artistic life?
All by accident.
Yeah.
The whole thing came by accident. I make because I make, as I've stated. I started a website called 15 Minutes of Play because people were asking, how do you make quilts without patterns? So I presented challenges to doing what I do. That became very popular. It was an interactive website and ran for quite a few years. It's still there. It's just I'm not active on it anymore, which led to the book, 15 Minutes of Play. And this was all kind of before social media rush. So when blogs were very new and very hot, happened at the right time in the right place, I guess. Because also I was working in a different way than other people. I wasn't writing patterns. I was working improvisationally. So then that happened. So then the book came out and I started teaching and lecturing. And then I went about making, the 13 double wedding ring quilts because I needed to make those. That was a personal journey. So then I made those, and then those were asked to be exhibited at the Wisconsin Quilt Museum. And I thought, after I'd made like 3 quilts, and I was like, but there's going to be like 13 and they're not done yet. They're like, we don't care. I was like, oh, great. So I made the quilts. They were exhibited, and then I said, well, you're going to do a book, right? That's how you got to say. That's how that happened. I designed fabric quite a while ago with the company and didn't really enjoy the experience. So then I let that go. So I thought, well, that would be a great way to bring my art background back into it. And that interests me. And then I started working with, different kinds of shapes and things like the double wedding ring and whatnot. So then I thought, well, I want my own shapes, and then other people seemed to want them as well when I was teaching. So then I started my template line. Like it all happens as it happens. One thing leads to another. I'm not a planner. I do not make lists. I lose them immediately. So things they happen as they happen. And the fabric came along after that. I went back to it again when another fabric company came back to me and said, come on, let's do this. I'm like, okay. So the opportunities present themselves, and I get to decide whether I say yes or no. And then the shop happened because most of my online sales and from teaching, all of the supplies and things used to be kept in my home studio, which I outgrew. So I rented a studio in the next building, and then my office space here became too filled with all of my products. So then I needed more space. And I said to my husband, I think I'm going to rent a space. He said, yes. So I moved it all out of my house. And that's why we went up with a store. Uh-huh. Yeah. So that works. Yeah.
That's very cool.
So it's all completely by accident. And I follow whatever happens next, and I just keep making because that's what I want to do.
Now, in your store, is your store devoted? It looks like it's devoted to your work only.
Only my own product.
That's really
everything in my store is my own product. It's my books, my patterns, my templates, my designs, my fabrics, all of that. Yeah, I just carry my own stuff because that's what I'm familiar with, and that's what I do.
It's really cool. Do you have? How has that been? So how is the online store is one thing. How is being, the store, now having the store, how has that been? How long?
The store has been around for 2 years. The website has been around for probably 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So it's 2 years on the store. And that's been wonderful because everybody comes to New York City and they want to visit the quilt shop. Totally. And those who are familiar with my work, people that will come to me are the people that are familiar with what I do. And so when they come in, I get to inspire them more. I get to show them quilts that I've made, all the quilts that I still want to make, and give them ideas on how else you can use it. And, and hopefully inspire that little spark in them to grow and to go create their quilts and make more beautiful quilts.
Okay, so I have 2 more questions. One is, one is about intellectual property because that's kind of the project's about. So we have to ask that question. It's kind of like sometimes I forget to ask it, which is really lame. But the other is I wanted to talk about on your website you have a book called Seeing Slowly by Michael Findlay.
My husband Michael
Yeah.
It has two parts, the value of art and seeing slowly.
And tell me what your life is like having, like, the conversations must be amazing, right? The art and thinking about things. Do you feel like that's part of your life, or is it like the humdrum of regular life gets in the way of like conversations like that?
So my husband's an art dealer here in New York City, and he has been in the industry since he was like 17 years old. So he's been around for a very long time in the art world. And as an artist, we of course were drawn to very similar things as far as what we like. And when we go to museums, we have very interesting conversations from my side being a maker and his side being on the selling side. So we always have very interesting conversations about things, and where we come together is about looking. He is a very good writer and talks very conversationally about what he's learned or what he likes or what he sees in the art world. I think a lot about what he talks about, particularly in Seeing Slowly, is also similar to what I'm teaching. And we get into very big conversations about this. So his thing is that, when people go into a museum, oftentimes people are very intimidated by art because they don't know anything. And then I come in and I say, you don't have to know anything. You have to know what you like. And so we get in this big conversation, and that's what he's talking about. And what I'm often talking about is, so if you're going into a museum, and I use this analogy when I'm in my lecture, I say, if I send you into a museum and I stand you in front of the Mona Lisa, and next to the Mona Lisa, there's a William de Kooning, which is an abstract figurative painter. Where will most people stand? Most people will stand in front of the Mona Lisa. Why do they stand in front of the Mona Lisa? Because it's familiar. They know something. That gives them comfort.
Yeah.
Other people, if you make them stand in front of the thing they don't understand, so put them in front of the abstract piece, and you say, okay, and I'll say, stand there for 15 minutes and look at it, and what do you see? So taking the time to stand there to look at it, you might go, oh, well, there's an eyeball up to the left. There's an eyeball down to the right. There's some pink. There's some blue. Ooh, I like that color. Like, the more time you spend with it to looking at it without feeling the need to be given the information, things start to come to you. And when that happens, that's the moment where ideas get created. So it's the same thing if I relate that to how I work on my design wall. If I put a piece of red somewhere and I'll be like, now do I like that there? Or does it need to go to the left or the right? Back to that conversation. It's all about looking. And it's also about trusting your intuition. I think one thing a lot of people we're very trained in the society to not use our intuition anymore, particularly in the arts. For instance, like I said, going to a museum, you want all the information. People go into a museum, they take a picture of it on their phone. They might even take a picture of the label so that they can go home, look at it on their phone, read about it, and then feel like they've known something, but they've never actually looked at the painting.
Right, and they may not even ever look at those things on the pictures on their phone either, right? So this documenting, right?
But you've never actually looked at it.
Yeah.
So that's then, so what he's talking about there is, you need to look. And when I'm in class and people go, well, I don't think this is going to look good. What do you think? I'm like, it doesn't matter what you think. Cut it, put it on the wall, and look at it. Now, what does it look like? Does it look good? Is it in the right place? Is it in the wrong place? Finding back to your intuition or your gut to tell you, is there something there?
That's really interesting. Now, I'm just going to push you just a little bit more on that, and then we'll end soon, I promise. This concept of good, of looking good. Like in copyright, we have this aesthetic non-discrimination thing where judges aren't supposed to judge art because they don't have any skill at judging art, that everything gets protected. When you look at something, or when you're trying to teach people about what is good, do you feel like good is it that thing of like, I like this, or is it an outside... You know what I mean? Like, how do you define good?
Personal opinion.
Yeah.
I'm looking at something to say, if it's good, it's giving me an emotional response.
Yeah.
So if a student says, well, what do you think? Does this look good? I say, well, what do you think? Does it look good to you?
Right.
It's not about what I think. It's about me getting you to look at what's in front of you and to make a decision. People spend way too much time deciding, is this the right red? Is that the right red? Just pick a red. Nobody else is ever going to care. Like I'm back to that list.
I totally have to tell you a story about the red. So
I have quilts that got to get made. I cannot.
Exactly. So when we moved into the house, it was a fixer-upper, and my husband wanted to paint the fireplace red, and so he kept painting it different red colors, and he painted so many different red colors that Sherwin-Williams cut him off and told him, "No, we're not giving you any more red. Like, you've got enough red." So that's that was what made me think of it. Is nobody's gonna care whether it's slightly more blue or whatever.
And just to wrap up on that thought is, okay, so say you pick a red and you make the quilt and you finish the quilt and you look back at that and you go, man, that was so the wrong red. Well, did you not just learn something then?
Right.
That's still the gift.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. You just need to make it. The more quilts you make, the better you get at looking.
Yeah.
You have to keep making and you have to keep looking. If that's what your goal is in the creative process of making.
Cool. All right. Well, I have like 1,000 more questions, but I'm going to ask you. I'm not going to. You've been so kind to chat with me, and I really appreciate. This is so cool. This is really awesome. You like talking about this? Well, I'm just.
You need to get on a soapbox too. So.
Yeah, it's fabulous. You're just amazing. Of course.
Fun. It's fun. You should be having fun. That's the joy. You should be having fun. So if you're really struggling, you need to find a way to cut loose those voices and get back to your instinct and listen. Listen to yourself and listen to see what is it saying.
I love it. I totally love it. All right, intellectual property. Any thoughts, worries? How much? So I have a philosophy of what this is, but I'm curious, like, how much does that interplay with what you do every day and on the commercial side as well?
Explain what you mean. I don't understand.
Well, so I suspect that intellectual property, copyrights, trademarks, patents, right of publicity, they protect what you do every day as an artist. It's what gives you the property right to have the shop that you have, so that other people don't sell your things. But what we see with intellectual property at this point, particularly coming from the movie industry, which we do work with, and the recording industry, is that where you used to have it as like the internet changed everything. So like how you make your money isn't by policing every little bitty thing that happens. It's more of a holistic, we love you as a brand. We buy your stuff because we love you. We trust you because we've done your work. And that's where that comes, that idea of sort of, why does it matter? Like, what role does law play? And I imagine it doesn't play a huge role in what you do every day, but it does protect your work.
Right. Okay. I don't know that this is going to answer your question, but this made me think of something that I think kind of relates to this.
Yeah.
There have been instances, of course, in the art and quilting world where people will make something and there's a conversation about what is derivative and not.
Yeah.
All right. So if I'm teaching a class on made fabric, I'm just as an example, there's no specific instance, I'm just using this as an example. So you take a class, my class, you do 15 minutes of play, you maybe use a block from my book or incorporate something that I've said into your quilt. There is this, you finish the quilt, you make it, you want to submit it to a quilt show. There's always a question, there's not always a question, but there's often a question, is this your own design? Right. Who do you give credit to your inspiration for?
Hugely.
Now, there's this interesting line, and I don't quite understand where this comes from. Somehow along the way, people think that it's an insult to them to give credit to who inspired them. That is something I do not understand. I love to tell people who has inspired me along the way. My grandmother. I wouldn't be doing any of this if I'd never found Tanya Rakuchi's blog, right? Antique quilts. I look mostly at antique quilts because there are artists back there who didn't know that they were artists and they were making really interesting quilts. I try not to look at what's going on today. I try not to look at popular books now. I want to come up with my own things based on shapes. But I find it very interesting. I get emails from people and they'll be like, well, I took your class and I used the made fabric and I've done, I've made this quilt and, I have to have permission to say that, I did that, but it's okay if it doesn't work because, it's still my quilt. And there's always this sort of secondary thing, like I don't know if they're ashamed or they don't feel they need to.
They just don't know, right?
They're very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They don't want to give me credit for inspiring them.
Oh,
and they feel they're like, it's like fist held tight on this. And I think it's a real privilege and a joy to be inspired by somebody. I don't know why people hold on to this so hard, be like, well, that's my idea.
It's defensive, right?
I give you tools and that you've made something really beautiful. And I'm really, really happy for you. Thank you for sending me that email and asking me. I appreciate that. Thank you for listing my name as inspiring. Do you know how wonderful that is for me to hear that I've made that moment for you?
Yeah.
That's fabulous. I want to share that. There are people that inspire me every single day. And I'm like, life would not be joyful without that inspiration. I don't understand why people feel so offended by having to give credit by somebody who inspired them.
Yeah. Okay. So let's end on this best practices, because this happened yesterday, where sort of the similar situation happened to us. An image got posted. It was an art quilter. Another group in around the world sent her saying, "Look what we did. We made a version of your thing, and can we publish it?" And she was really upset about it and she posted online, and then somehow she got to me because of what I do. And what's the best practice? So they see somebody's inspired by your quilts, or they take your class, or they've created a derivative work of your work. Like, do you want them to be asking permission? Do you want them to ask permission before they begin? Like at what point should they be contacting the artist? Because I think there's an intimidation factor as well of like, at what point am I asking permission or not, I guess?
So again, this goes back to what I said earlier about some of my quilts are not patterned. So if you're looking through my book and you're like seeing a quilt and there's not a pattern in the book and you're like, wow, that's really cool. And I make a fairly close derivative of it. I may have changed the colors, but the design is absolutely the same. I've seen a few quilts around the internet lately where I'm like, I thought that it was somebody else's quilt because it was such a clear copy of the original quilt, and it wasn't. That's a fine line.
Yeah. When you can't determine that it's yours, that it's so close that now, let's say they do it, because I think about like being in art school and you're supposed to, probably not when you were in art school, but the old-timey art school of when you do the masters and you make versions of it. But what was different was you weren't posting it on the internet. So it was your own private, like if I say, oh, I want to make that quilt so that I see if I can do it that way, that's really different than just changing the colors, would you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and this goes back to what I said about, people feeling very insecure, because even if they've looked at, you can just pick any quilt that I've done, like say my double-edged love, it's copied, the concept is copied constantly.
Yeah.
But none of them ever look exactly like it. That's fine. And I love to see it, and I'm happy that you put your name on it. If you go in and you start picking the exact same colors and looking at strategically putting like the same bones back into that quilt and following, where I left something out, whatever, right. Like those are all of my personal creative decisions. Where are you in that story anymore?
Yeah.
Just because you've copied it or made, things that look very similar to it, it's not yours anymore. You are not making any of those personal decisions. So that's why I keep telling people, like, make your own quilts. I'm giving you shapes that you can play with. You get to drop different things into it. You can construct it differently. You can add other elements. There's so much out there for you to do. Quilting is like a giant play sandbox. There are so many toys in the sandbox to play with.
So you don't think it's
personal touch to it and make it look different. You don't have to make my quilt. What do you have to say? What can you say? Just because you're copying it doesn't make yours unique. You just have to put some more of your own personal choices in there. There's so many more things that you can do to it that I haven't done.
So do you think? So I think about when I grew up, I did Danish cross stitch with my mom, which is this ridiculous, So and it was all about following the pattern, and I was always like, I screw it up. I didn't like to rip out, so I'm like, okay, well now it's not a person, it's a house, right? So I figured out a way to like not have to rip out, right? But the point of that, and for my mother, was getting it right. And so sometimes I think that it isn't out of like that some quilters out there are like my mom, doesn't feel creative. She wants to do what you did because she loves what you did. How do you feel about those people that are like my mom, that are like, I want to make that the way they did it, and that's the art in itself, or not even craft, but maybe the craft in it, is there a space for those people that don't want to be creative but just want to replicate? Or do you think that that's not what quilting's about?
That's why there's a pattern.
That's why there's a pattern. That's right.
That information to be able to replicate it.
Yeah.
So if it's not in a pattern, it's not there for you to be replicated.
I love that. That divide is such a nice divide. It's clear.
That's the commercial division between what I do as an artist and what I do as a thing. So if I make a quilt and I think, okay, this is pretty cool, people are going to want to make this. There are the people who want to duplicate it. That's perfectly fine. That's why there's a pattern for that.
Yeah.
So if you're at a quilt show and you find a quilt and you're like, oh, I could go home and do that, just remember there are people in this industry. We're not making lots of money here doing this stuff. That's the other kind of myth that I think is really interesting. People are like, well, I'm not going to pay $12. I'm going to give that pattern to all of my friends now that I've paid for it. It's like, well, it's not yours to give. We spent that time to do that and to share it. Or you could go figure it out. Some people like to look at a quilt and just go figure it out, but you got to remember that's where it becomes a copy. That's not your work.
That's not your work. That's right. That's right. And that's what the copyright law says too. So, I mean, you can revert. I mean, there's a whole bunch. It's complicated, but that sort of taking money out of pattern makers is not a good thing. Buy the pattern. Just buy it.
Well, I also think we're in a very interesting situation in the quilting world itself. Economy, all of that kind of stuff. We have the baby boomers who are maybe not buying as much as they were. We have the newer quilters who are coming up who are not quite ready to, hit all the big quilt shows and spend the huge amount of money yet. There's a small gap in the bubble of the quilting world. So, we have to keep it going. We all need to play nice. There's too much free stuff on the internet. Like, you got to support your shops. You got to support your stores and your designers because it has to get through the bubble.
Yeah, it's got to get through the
bubble coming where, the younger generation of buyers is still coming up, to have that sort of income to keep the industry going. And it's important. And that's the thing where it gets sketchy with the internet and how much stuff is out there is, what happens to all of that? I don't know what happens to that. We're all going to find out what happens to that.
So interesting. We live in interesting times, don't we?
We do.
Interesting. Well, this is
the beauty of this is that we have such a cool industry itself. The quilting world, I can go anywhere. That's the other part of social media that is really nice about that. I can go anywhere in the world and I can be like, hey, I'm going to Tokyo. Where are all the Tokyo quilters? Right? And I can show up and I immediately have friends.
It's so cool.
I don't know them, but I know them.
You know them. Right.
That's the beauty and
Love
the fabulous tool of what we have with the internet and the quilting industry itself.
It's really remarkable, isn't it?
That's the joy. That's the part that keeps us all coming back together and why I keep making, because I love it. I love going out and meeting the quilters. I love watching light bulb moments go off so that you all can go make beautiful quilts. I get so many ideas when I'm teaching a class from my students. Like they'll be working on something, they might not see something, and I'll be like, oh, that's so cool. Now I can go home and I can work out that idea. And what can I do with that? And yeah, so it works both ways. I give ideas, I get ideas. It's very cool that way.
Well, this has been the best way to start a Friday morning I have had. It's really great. I appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness. It's just really, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Thank you for reaching out. I'm really pleased. Always happy to talk to you.
Oh, this is great. So this is Elizabeth Townsend-Gard. You've been listening to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. We want to hear from you. Join our army, our quilting army. Go to our Facebook page. Suggest people